Okay, so we've been talking about death all day, so I thought I'd lighten the mood by talking about death. Death is a great subject to talk about. When we talk about meditation sometimes, and mental states, and spiritual practice, it can, I think, be caught up in the overall consumerist mindset that exists in our society. And it can sound subtly, to me at least, off-putting sometimes, the idea of my meditation practice and things, even though we don't stress it like that. But when you're talking about death, death is not a consumerist theme, you know. They don't say simply be dead. They don't put that in the adverts today. It's not a great mental state. It's almost pleasing in its facticity, death. It sort of is a... And actually, it's in a way, it's not a fact, because many people don't actually agree with what it means, or what it connotes. So what it actually is to call it a fact, is open to dispute in some ways. But anyway, we can call it a fact. Something happens. The body does decay away. So yes, it's a great theme, death, but it's also a difficult theme to talk about. So if I was talking about meditation, I could probably convince you that I roughly know something about meditation, having done it, but I haven't died. So it's a difficult subject to talk about, and I talk about it with humility, really, and a sense of what I'm going to share is my journey. And you could say this talk is about why a view of death matters, why it matters what view we hold about it. And it's my journey from nihilism to just a little bit beyond nihilism. And I think that's quite an ambitious, big journey to go on. And the other thing I want to do during the talk is the second part of the talk will be remembering 3 Sangha members. So we have these stupas on the shrine that just sit there at the back. Wonderfully, on this beautiful shrine we have, they've come forward, and we've got more of a chance to look at them and admire them. And they are 6 people who died, clearly, and whose ashes are in there. And these people were all buried following or cremated following services in this shrine room. And, you know, I suspect quite a few people in this room will lie in this shrine room at some point. So I will sort of remember them and rejoice in them and draw out a few points in connection with that. But rather than start with Sangha members, what I'd like to do is start where a lot of us first encounter death, and that's with the death of a grandparent. So when I was about 10 years old, I remember my grandfather one day. He used to smoke cigars. He was an optician, and he was also a philosopher, a self-made philosopher. He used to teach meditation. He had pupils, and he was a real knower of literature and poetry and Eastern religion, Eastern mysticism, Tao, and all of this was his. He loved it. He was also quite a mean fellow, according to my mum. He was obsessive. You couldn't borrow a pencil from him. He was finicky about everything, and to the point of being mean and quite difficult to live with. That was my mum's version, and I think it's fair enough. I knew him, and it's true. So he said to me, we're about 10 years old, he said to the family, we were gathered there one Sunday, that he'd bought a burial plot in a cemetery in South London. And I remember later on lying in bed, sort of considering this burial plot. It was a large burial plot they had bought. And it just begged a lot of questions to me when I was 10. I had Grandpa and my Nana were sort of, I imagine them on the bottom layer. The next layer up was my mum and dad. And the top layer was me and my sister. And the dog fitted in awkwardly somewhere in there. And it was horrific. And you know, in a way, there wasn't a great deal I could do with that imagery. I was just left with us in there. So I just suppose, what was I told about death at that age by my parents? Well, I wasn't really told anything about death by my parents, or really by my wider society. There was obviously the Christian view of death that I did imbibe, But the Christians, the atmosphere around the culture I came from, the way we related to Christianity was sort of, bless them, wish it was so. I wish I could believe that, but we've moved on from that. We've moved on from the hunter-gatherers society as well. We can't go back to Christianity and those beliefs. We have scientific views now, so it wasn't of any significance to me, that. Then the choice was between atheism and agnosticism. And agnosticism seemed really nice because you say, well, I don't know, maybe. But in a way, it's quite an easy view to hold, isn't it? It's quite open-minded on the one hand, but it's a bit easy, and it's a bit intellectual. So you'd have to decide intellectually between agnosticism and atheism. That was about the choices that you had. And I usually opted for agnosticism. My mum was an atheist. Dad didn't put down the newspaper long enough to think about those sorts of things. But it was very divorced from actual death, very divorced from fear of death and the reality of it. It was just an idea, really. Underneath, I think, that I had imbibed was the cultural view to which we hold without really knowing that we hold it, which is scientific materialism and nihilism. So when I was imagining my family stacked up in this large plot, I mean, it was in keeping with my grandpa's fastidiousness to buy a burial plot a long time in advance. But it was unusual that he'd been so generous as to consider the needs of everybody else in the family. So it was just horrible. I just had to fill with my imagination this blank of death. And it made me cry. I remember crying about that reality. Because death just appears as this horrible blank expanse. And I call this naive nihilism. It's the nihilism that you think about because you're there experiencing it. It's not real nihilism. You're actually, somehow when you're a child, you're imagining that you're there, trudging across an endless expanse of just nothing. I mean, I can't really imagine what's worse image than that, really. Hell would be, at least there's something going on. So then, about 8 years later, my grandfather did die, and my sister and I were invited to go into his study. He had a study that was lined with glass bookcases, big mahogany things, and they had a very nice desk with his optical equipment all laid out on it, all the glasses and the things you put in your eyes when you're testing them. And he was on the desk in a coffin, in an open coffin. This was how he wanted to be laid out. And we were allowed to go and see him. We were asked if we wanted to, and we did want to, because you would want to, wouldn't you, if your grandfather was in the study and you're in the kitchen. You go and have a look. So I remember creeping up to his coffin and seeing his nose appear over the top, and then a sort of grey bit of his face, and then he used to smoke cigars, so he had yellow hands. And I just stood there watching him, feeling a bit embarrassed that I could look at him and he couldn't look back. I felt that awkwardness of being able to examine his features, which was very uncomfortable. But the worst thing that I felt this shame. I felt embarrassed, and not embarrassed, I felt actually shamed, because the thought that occurred to me was that all of his learning was a complete waste of time. All of his books, he wrote a book on meditation, hardly many people read it, or even, it was too difficult. And he was a difficult man. There wasn't a lot of overflowing love and grief within our family. I loved him, and I won't say that he wasn't loved, but I didn't want to end up in a sort of a cold. He was so mean that he rarely heated the house. So for once, his study was at the right temperature. Yeah, for looking after him. But I didn't want to end up like that, and I just felt ashamed that I had the thought that it was a total waste of time. Every bit of poetry he'd ever learned off by heart, every bit of Kierkegaard and Buddha and all of it, it was a waste of time. And that, I think the reason I felt that was because I assumed that he was his thoughts, that he really was just his thoughts, and his thoughts were now nowhere his thoughts were in his brain cells and they were now curdling somewhere in his brain. I didn't have any frame at all for thinking about him as extending beyond this point at all, and it seemed to diminish what he was and what he'd done with his life. And I had this, obviously I didn't think of it all like that when I was just standing there, but I felt the shame that I'd had that thought. But by that time I was 18 and I had matured to what I would call nihilism proper, actual full-on nihilism, that where you're not naive anymore. You don't imagine that you're going to be down there kind of experiencing life going on somehow dead. You're imagining the expunging of life, the complete cessation and annihilation of life. That's a more committed kind of materialism. And I know that probably we all hold shades of views about death, and I'm not talking for other people, but my sense, the overwhelming view that had grown into me was it. Death was it. And it wasn't a view, it was a fact. And it was manifest in front of me, and there was no argument about it. But according to let's first explore how did we get to this point? Because we've got to a point when we've got to nihilism. It's not just, we've arrived at this point. Recently, there's been a lot of interest in the scientific world from around 1750 to 1850, which was a time when the last great polymaths, I read a book about Alexander von Humboldt, there's Erasmus Darwin, and these were people who were pursuing knowledge, but they were pursuing the whole. They were just pursuing knowledge in any of its forms. They would talk with philosophers, poets, astronomers, they would talk with chemists. Eventually they would talk with psychologists, they would talk with anybody, and they were just trying to understand life. They were really genuinely in the pursuit of what is going on. Obviously this is a complex story, but at some point it seems that the myth of that pursuit, which may have been held by Christianity, which was held by Christianity, as in the pursuit of truth, somehow that broke that myth. And also the sciences developed to the point whereby people were specialising in sciences and no longer able to hold the whole field of knowledge, really. It was only these really great individuals who could discourse across so many subjects. And then, in a way, through a whole series of very interesting things, which I'm not going to try and unpack, but empirical science won the battle for truth. So all truth became objective truth. The empirical scientists dominated the whole field of what could be said to be true. And I guess the arts, even the religion, and then psychology, they all had interesting things to say, but they were subjective. Interesting but subjective. We give them some funding, keep them going a bit, they're nice, they make life a bit better. But actually what's going on is objective fact. That's what you should study. And of course this has brought enormous, and I think there's a sincerity in that. There's a sincerity in the way that we study facts and scientists pursue truth and objective truth. Many really do want to find out what is going on in matter. But of course, when you get down into matter and you incorporate many of the truths of the 20th century, the relativism and quantum theory, you realise it isn't what it appears to be, even at the level of matter. And that's, of course, an enormous adjustment that we haven't really made. So you have materialism, seems to have won the day. And materialism is the view from nowhere. That's what it's called. It's called a view from nowhere. That's the conceit of science, is that there isn't we're just studying what's going on. And I'm able to do that. I'm able to sit down and read data and understand things, and that's what's going on. I'm not bringing any values to that. It's not affected by my mind. It's not affected by perception, by the perceptual apparatus I have. It's just a view from nowhere. That seems to be what is in the background of scientific endeavour. And it has huge benefits, particularly, of course, if you're talking about technology and all the wondrous things. Let's acknowledge all the wondrous things that objective science has managed to bring out. And I want to stick up for materialism before I demolish it, or I try to. Because I think it's half right. And I'm very nervous about trying to go beyond materialism, because I am a bit of a materialist. But I've moved away a little bit. So I think materialism, you have a view that I am my body. Yeah, that's the core view, I am my body. So whatever the mind is, and we don't know really what the mind is, but maybe it's something, maybe it's not something, maybe it's just a phenomena that bright for a while and then dies away. But it doesn't seem very likely, at any rate, that it's going to survive the death of my body, whatever it is. And I want to stick up for that view in the sense that my sense of myself, Satyadasa, order member, da-di-da, whatever I think about myself, all the conditions that have given rise to me, my personality, my likes, dislikes, all the relationships, my connections, that will die when my body dies. I'm not saying that means that's it, or that's the only significance of that, but that seems a reasonable intuition, that Satyadasa, when he's dead, he's dead. But it's unexplored. So what I want to talk about is what Buddhism brings into the picture here. Materialism, if you just sort of imbibe it as a cultural view, you haven't really explored it. So what does Buddhism bring into this picture? I think it brings in a tremendous amount. And the first thing is it rebalances the picture. It gives us a way of attending to the world as a whole. And this is an incredible thing. It brings the subject back into the picture. And it gives us a way, and one of the most brilliant books about this is Dr. Ian McGilchrist's The Master and His Emissary, which is called The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. And he's coming to the Buddhist Centre later this year. Watch out for that. And coming to Poetry East, I should say. And he says that there's two ways that we seem to be able to pay attention to the world. And the first way is immediate. It's an embodied awareness. It's ever-changing. It is in relationship with others. It's right now. It's this moment in all its ungraspableness. And part of our brains are particularly attuned for this type of knowing, which is whole. And then there's another type of knowing which is abstracted. So it's very useful. It's a way to abstract things from all the experience that we have. We build concepts, thoughts. It tends towards more linear type thinking and getting things done. So these two ways of modes of knowing the world, ways of paying attention, need to be in harmony with each other. And his thesis is that this whole way of attending, which we might call mindfulness, which we might call embodied awareness, is largely been etoliated. Is that a word? I don't know. It's been reduced. And the other way of attending to the world has become the key way that we attend to the world. And that's a problem for society. So I think Buddhism definitely gives us, it brings back the whole, it brings back the subject, it brings back values in a very explicit way that we can work with and see in our minds. This is a huge benefit. The second way that Buddhism helps, I think, particularly with our views and our views around materialism, is that Buddhist practice is about changing our perception of reality. It's not just about having a better mental state or that would be good, wouldn't it? That would be good to be a bit better like that. But it's through puja, through mindfulness, through metta, through reflection, through using the core reflexive practices like we were doing this morning, the 4 reminders, the noble truths, the lakshanas. This is all about changing our perception of reality. And the remarkable thing about the Buddha's teaching is he says we can investigate this here and now. We can, as we investigate what's happening, we can undergo this process, which is variously referred to as letting go, recognizing clinging and identification, and recognizing how our sense of ourselves is conditioned by our minds, and particularly by craving and aversion, particularly by all the pride and all the varieties of craving, aversion and ignorance. And that is what conditions our sense of ourselves. So if you're a materialist, fine, in a way. Fine, it's quite convincing in one way. But the Buddhist invitation is to look in and start to investigate. And through that, so if you were a materialist, it's quite obvious that you're going to be quite scared of death, because it's so bleak. I don't really know how anybody could really front up to the pure form of materialism or nihilism. Maybe some people do. In a way, it's quite a brave thing to hold to that. Maybe when we die, I have noticed with people that sort of other views about death naturally emerge, and it's not so clear what we actually believe about death. But it's only death is the crucial situation which forces us to really. People come up with all sorts of beliefs, and when you witness friends die, loved ones die, family die in particular, you realise, I don't know, I thought I knew, but other thoughts pop out of your mouth. So that if you were a materialist, you would just think that the world, when I die, I am my body. The world carries on -1. There's the world going on, but it carries on -1. Now Buddhism challenges that view. It will make you realise that the way that I think about myself, the way that the very sense of this core sense of me being a thing in the world which exists independently of the world, which is having an experience of an objective world out there, that gets challenged by Buddhist practice, and something else gets opened up. So the third thing that Buddhist practice brings a sense of wholeness. It gives us a way back to a broader way of experiencing the world. It changes our perception of reality, and it gives us a way of getting back to that thing which we've lost, which is a vision of something which is beyond subjective and objective. And this is what the Buddha experienced on the night of his awakening. So I think it's really important when we're thinking about death is that we're not really thinking about death. In Buddhist practice, it's not really, its main concern is the Buddha's awakening. And you have to confront death, and you have to confront fear of death in order to experience that. But that's the main thing. On the night of the Buddha's awakening, he as you probably recall, he sat under the Bodhi tree. It's a beautiful place to visit if you've never visited. And when I visited it, I was naive enough to think that it was pretty much that tree, or at least in that spot. And that was good enough for me. That really was good enough. And I felt terribly moved just to be underneath the Bodhi tree. He sat there all night, gradually growing in confidence and insight. And having all the meetings with the various forms of mind that can arise, the various forms of greed, hatred and delusion that arose in him. And in the final, it's said in the tradition, the actual moment of his awakening was just as the dawn light was coming, and he saw the morning star. He opened his eyes and he saw the morning star, and that was the moment of awakening. And it's a beautiful image, seeing a star. We've all done it. It's something you kind of want to get back to when you kind of have the opportunity. And what it does to me is it challenges my perception when I look at stars. And I think it's a great way to bring in all the things that science tells us about stars as well, because I was reading about this telescope that they're creating, which can look back 13 billion years, or will be able to. I mean, that's an amazing thought, isn't it? It can see light which has been travelling for 13 billion years. And very close to the beginning of time, a mere billion years or so from the beginning of time. And what you're seeing is the light. As the Buddha said, in the seen there's only the seen. You're not seeing the star as it exists at this moment, because that is just a construction in your mind, really. We imagine that there's a star which is now 13 billion years sort of sitting there being 13 billion years older than we can see it. It's very strange once you start thinking about all of this, because there's no way of accessing that at all, as far as we know. That's beyond the speed of light, so it's beyond perception. and it may have just vanished. And even to think of it as vanishing is more than you're adding all that on to the experience. It's a reasonable intuition that there's something going on outside of your perception. But what I have all these thoughts, you wouldn't like to go on solitary retreat with me, I'll tell you. If you're in my mind, I can't just relax and enjoy the stars. I have to start thinking, is those stars in my mind? What does distance mean? And the word for star is Tara. Ratna Prabha gave a great talk here a few years ago where he said the word is Tara, and the word for the pupil in the eye in Sanskrit is also Tara. So it's just this vision of the Buddha looking and seeing this star, which is the morning star we'd call, which is Venus for us. It's Venus, which has all those associations, and it's deep in his eye as well. There's this resonance between what's outside and inside, and the Buddha had his awakening at that moment. And this is what arose at that moment was the transcendent knowledge towards which Buddhist practice is really gunning. That's a wrong word. That's a wrong metaphor. So this is what liberates. This is what ends delusion. This is really what brings. If you are considering a subject like death, this is what brings death into a different perspective. Of course, this is vast, and it's something to be cultivated. Just an imaginative sense of what that is pointing to. So this in Buddhism is what we take refuge in. We don't take refuge in death. We don't take refuge in a dead body. We don't take refuge in the view that I am my body. And we don't take refuge also in the view that I will exist after my death in a sort of permanent form somewhere, parked up. We take refuge in the Buddha and the Buddha's awakening. And this is a transcendent knowledge. It's beyond subject and object. That's a very dry way of putting it. It is joy. It is pure freedom. It's a release from the deepest type of suffering, which comes out of believing in the believing things are the way that they appear to be. I exist in a world, and I'm hurtling towards the death of my body, and when I die, its world carries on -1. And it's a very powerful reflection. This is what we're opening up is a realm that's beyond self-preoccupation, beyond self-concern, and that's the pointing of Buddhist practice, and that's what we cultivate our minds towards and our hearts. So that's the Buddha and the Buddha's awakening. We'll come back to the Buddha and the Buddha's death, but I'd like to move on to mention a few people who've died, mainly because they're people I knew and I loved, and I just want to remember them. And also, it seems appropriate. So the first person is Vidya Jyoti. Who here remembers Vidya Jyoti? I know she does, yeah. So quite a few people, yeah. She died 10 years ago now. She was 72. She was born in Brooklyn, in New York. And she was in a Jewish family there. She came, I don't know when she came to this country, because I first met her when I went on my first retreat in 1997, and she was operating the tea urn. She was a social worker, I think, but I didn't think that never played in my mind. She was an artist. She was a great talker. She was mischievous. She used to call me Little David. But I was actually quite a bit taller than her. But that was the nickname I got. She was deliberately impious, I would say. Akasha Mitra was remembering that after a talk, I'm glad she's not here, because after a talk once, she took him by the arm and said, "God, what a terrible talk." She'd sort of say things that were quite true, but then a bit later she'd feel, she had a streak of lacking self-confidence, so she'd get worried by some of the things she'd said, and she'd come back to you for a little bit of reassurance that she hadn't overstepped the mark or something. She loved this community here. She was always here. She's just here all the time helping out on events. She she had cancer, and she did all the usual things of the procedures and trying to live. She did all sorts of things, and I want to just remember the people who. What my reflection when I'm thinking about her was how wonderfully people looked after her. I remember Ushi, you looked after her beautifully, and Klashmitra, but particularly I thought Pranya Devi was a real example to me. I hadn't realised how important it was to just tell someone how much they're loved, tell someone all the good things people have been saying about them, remind them of all the things they've done. And Pranya Devi just did that day in, day out. I used to go, by the time she was in the hospice, there were crowds of people trying to come and see Vidya Jyoti. They had to sort of form a queue and regulate that. And Pranya Devi was often there just whispering things to Vidya Jyoti, reminding her when she got a bit upset or when she was a bit, anxious. And I could visibly see how that helped her. And so much so, all the love that she received from the Sangha, I remember she said towards the end of her life that it was like she'd won the lottery, but she had no time to spend it. And I think that what she was sort of realizing was that the self-doubt that she felt was baseless in some way, and that death had sort of opened up that. So yes, and death, it deepens the whole Sangha. It's something real. In a way, Vidya Jyoti, who's the colourful stupa over there, a beautiful, colourful one, she first got involved around the time that this man here, Vangisa, who's just behind me, died in 1981. And she was very moved by his funeral. And the funerals that we do here are really, come along, they're great. The marvellous thing about the Sangha is, this is why I called this talk Death in the Sangha, is because you get to sort of experience death so much more, and in so many more, with so many more shades of kind of connection with people you hardly know, people you never met, people you know well, people you're deeply friends with for many decades, in a way that probably introduces you, warms you up to the whole topic of death more than you would naturally get. And we had a wonderful celebration of her when she died. So that's Vidya Jyoti. The next person is Mahananda, who is in that other smaller one, that slightly more golden one that was made, a stupa. It's got his picture on it if you want to have a look. Very small. That was made by Naga Siddhi. He died a year before Vidya Jyoti, and he too was Jewish. His mother was from Vienna. His father was a Polish Catholic. Now, I can't possibly sum up Mahananda. If you knew him, I can't. It would be another whole talk, and I feel like I'm not going to do him justice. But I lived upstairs with him. I shared a bedroom with him. We slept toe to toe almost on a long bunk there for a year. And I just really thought of doing this. I'd love to go and do that year again with Mahananda. I enjoyed it at the time. He was so good to be with. He was so solicitous and friendly and generous. He was also weepy and exaggerated and could get wildly annoyed. When he got too stressed in the community, he used to go outside and smoke a spliff in his car. He was just a brilliant and kind of like, he was a kind of wonderful mess in some ways, but he was very intelligent as well. He practiced the Dharma in this shrine room, meditating not every morning, but for 12 years, he lived in the community. And what he had to battle with in his life was that his mother was in Auschwitz. She was a survivor, and he was an only child. And he felt guilt. Survivors of people who've been through those terrible ordeals feel responsible to the level of extreme guilt about what's happened to their parent. And he was homosexual, so he didn't have any inclination to repopulate her family that had been completely decimated during that time. So it added this intense grief and tragedy, tragic sense to his life with his mother there. She came to the Buddhist Center in quite a few times, just because she'd been invited, but she was quite a character. She was a very tough and intelligent woman, and they had a difficult relationship. So a lot of he was an artistic man. He was always making things, painting things, buying crazy things, embroidering his life in his house with just crazy stuff. And a lot of it was an attempt to just work out his own inner life. And it was highly creative in a way, and it was painful. He had a difficult life. His name means great happiness. Maitreya Bandhu ordained him in 2002. And, no, probably a bit later. Anyway, let's say 2002. And it did release him. It did something to changed in him, that he was no longer completely identified with that tragic and terrible family history. I went to Auschwitz with him twice, and it was a very moving experience, and his battle with that. His death, I mean, the way he engaged with this, he was a storyteller. He did children's events. He did puppetry. He looked after carers' retreats. In a lot of things, he played the accordion to the carers. He had this accordion which he couldn't play very well at all. He used to stop and start. It was all part of the performance. He'd say, no, stop. And then he'd start again. Okay, and they started again. And it was just so awful but wonderful to hear. So he died suddenly. He died in the space of a day. He was found by a friend, and he'd had a stroke in the night, and he never regained consciousness. And myself and my partner Joanna and Maitreya Bandhu got to the hospital quite quickly. But there was nothing that could be done. The bleeding was too deep in his brain. And he died later that day, and there was a goodly number of Buddhists and other friends who had gathered. We chanted in the hospital around his bed. And so the thing I reflected on from his death, there's many things. And he said, Maitreya Bandhu used to say, he said, a very eventful afterlife, Mahananda. He was one of those lives that seems to go on in people's imaginations for some time. I noticed it is dying away a bit now, 11 years later. So I'm glad to mention him again. But the reflection that I had about that was that, as Subhadramati was saying, was the benefits of preparing for death on a very simple level. He wrote a will just before he died, and he didn't have a will, and he didn't have any relatives. If he hadn't written the will, he gave his house to the London Buddhist Centre, and this was what allowed Vajrasana to come into being. So we're all beneficiaries of his family's. If you've been to Vajrasana, we're all beneficiaries of his family's wealth. And I suppose that I don't know what it's like to die or to die suddenly, but I imagine that there must be scenarios where people die too quickly to put their affairs together, and that it must be disturbing if you realise that there's something that you need to do that you haven't done that you can't do. There might be a window of that. So this is not a business pitch. I'm sending you somewhere else. I'm not interested. Basically, it's. I mean, even Socrates, when he died, he was forced to drink poison, I think, after the trial, and he woke up even past the point where they thought he was dead, and said, "Oh, I borrowed a couple of roosters from so and so. Could you pay him back?" Just. It's important that we tie up our affairs and we make our affairs, and that's a practice through life, simplifying your affairs. That's really just means simplifying, keeping your affairs. I say that, I don't keep my affairs very simple at all. But at least when it comes to death, we can think ahead, because we know that's going to happen. Lastly, I want to mention a Sangha Sheila, and then I'll go on to, a couple more things before the Buddha. A Sangha Sheila is here, as it were. He died 18 years ago. He lived in the community upstairs also, in Sukhavati. Probably not so many of you remember a Sangha Sheila, but I know a few of you will. He was a big man. He was not a tall man. He was a big man. He was a northerner. I'm not sure where he was from. Burnley maybe, or something like that. He could be a little bit gruff. He was also He's very funny. He one fact about him is he used to be it wasn't a secret, so I can say this. He used to be a drug smuggler who became a drug addict. This is before he lived in Sukhavati. Okay, Sukhavati is not a den of just drug users. Don't call the press. He long before he was involved in Buddhism, he had this past, and part of what drove him to Buddhism was the wisdom that this was the wrong way to live, and that he was lucky to avoid dying actually as an addict. And he came into Buddhism with that kind of a knowledge, that kind of a passion that he was really going to change his life. He paid off all his debts. He made good on a lot of things that he needed to make good on. He started working for a charity as fundraising. He adopted a daughter. He did many, many things to really make his life, make a difference in his life. And he was only 54. He was making plans to go back to India and start to do work over there. But he got lung cancer, which developed into secondary cancer in the brain. And he then moved out to spend more time with his daughter and his family. So I didn't see him a lot, but I was talking to Ratnagosha, who used to be the chair here, and he said he saw Sangha Sheila going through stages of denial, stages of being very angry about what had happened, and all of that. But then he said something, and he reported this back to the community, and I was only 20-something, and it really struck me. He said, well, some days it was like sitting with a saint. Some days it was like, in his last days, it was like sitting with a saint. He was the best he had ever been in the last few days of his life. And he said, Ratnagosha, who I regarded Ratnagosha as the saint. If anyone was a saint there weren't many saints in our communities, you're probably getting that impression. But Ratnagosha probably had the biggest call on that. And yet here he was saying that he was learning something. It was like everything Sangha Sheila did and said was a teaching. And Ratnagosha was just somehow had been surpassed by this sort of quite sort of blunt, somewhat gruff, funny man. Had suddenly become somebody who was really, really together. I mean, together is the wrong word. Yeah, he was like a saint. And this is, what a thought this is. This really struck me as a thought that death is something that is an opportunity. The process of dying is an opportunity. And I don't know, the Buddhist perspective on this is that anybody can make strides and spiritual progress around death. Anybody. It doesn't matter whether you're a Buddhist, whether you've done a lot of practice or a little bit of practice. It doesn't matter how you conceive of yourself, whether you're still full of pride and anger and explosive emotions. It doesn't matter if you're depressed and you think badly of yourself and you lack confidence. It doesn't matter. You can make progress around the time of death, because death is what Bhante Sangharakshita called enforced meditation. It's the crucial situation. There isn't anything, as Subhadra Mati was saying, there isn't anything like death apart from death. And I think this is just, this doesn't tell you what death is, but it certainly gives me a sense that maybe I've misjudged this. As a sort of materialist coming from where I've come from, maybe I have misjudged this, and that there's something to be lived all the way up to that point. There's something, and that maybe, and this is very clear that the Buddhist tradition says, especially if you're practiced, and you think of a Sangha Sheila and you think of the things that he'd cultivated in his mind in the latter part of his life, it's almost like they came back to him. They came back to him and they allowed him. I can't imagine that would have happened had he not practiced. Who knows? I don't know. But this practice, these intentions that he had set up in his life were there for him when he died. And they magnified. Now, you can't, I don't know what death is, but that is pretty profound. That struck me when I was 20 as a thought. And, Jnanavaccha, my good friend Jnanavaccha, is always saying he's quite looking forward to death. He's quite curious as to how it would be. And, I want to be around people like that. And I want to learn from people who have not the grim, unspoken, silent view of death that I grew up with. So I want to lastly talk about my mother, and then I think I should mention the Buddha. My mother was buried 2 years ago, today, maybe yesterday, I think. All this talk about death, and it's hard, isn't it? It's really hard when a loved one dies. Somebody a bit, it can be difficult and it brings up all sorts of thoughts. But when somebody really close to you dies, it's really hard. My mum was 69 years old, and she was immediately diagnosed with an incurable cancer, and we went through a year of turmoil. And I at times felt like, well, what good was my Buddhist practice? Because I was doing my best as a loyal son. I was trying to sort out this and that and make things good, and I wasn't, you're just dragged along by the circumstance, really. I was very angry at times, not with my mum, but I was angry about the chemotherapy that she only had 4 weeks without receiving chemotherapy in the last year of her life, and I think chemotherapy is fine at times, and I didn't have a problem with it, but it just was a bit too much. It was a bit too much in the end, and it upset me quite deeply. There's a book by Dr. Atal Gawande, called, I can't remember what it's called, Being Mortal, yes, that's it, thanks. And he talks about the medicalization of death and how we medicalize it right up to the very end. And there are two systems, aren't there? There's the medicalized system, and the doctors, they're really trying to help. There's no doubt about that. There's compassion. They want their patients to recover. The care was good, and I've had time to reflect on that and withdraw my anger from that. But I think there's a lack of wisdom, which is the materialist comes from this materialist position, and not having any positive view of death, not having any sense of what we can do around death. Feeds itself, it gets inflected into the medical system too. Obviously, that's just part of our society. And when you get into the hospice system, this is what Atal Gawande talks about. He talks about care from a different perspective, say geriatric care and the hospice system. Suddenly, it's quite different. The wisdom is being embodied more, and it's a relief. It's very painful to transfer over to the hospice system because you know what it means. But when you do, you realise. We had the district nurse come round to my mum, and I never forget it. It was just my mum was really emaciated from the therapy, chemotherapy, and the illness as well. And she got a letter saying, well, give it a rest for a little while, and maybe you could have some more treatments. And the district nurse came round and said to my mum, what do you think you'd like at your funeral? Which music would you like? And my mum was sort of shocked by this. But somebody had to say it, somebody had to say it. And I was very grateful that she had said it in such a direct manner, because it was manifestly obvious that my mum was barely going to get out of bed again, let alone, do anything else. So there is this wisdom, and it's very complex. It's a very difficult area because there's a lot of desperation, understandable desperation, and difficult emotions. And I'm not knocking our health system at all. It is great, but it didn't. In some ways it didn't quite serve my mother, but it was difficult. Let's just leave it at that. But I want to say something positive, and that is that towards the end of my mother's life, I realised that we were all on a family retreat, and the core teaching that I'd learned was what I do with my mind is important at this stage. What I do and how I am is really important for my mother. And I don't know about death. I don't know what exactly I was doing, but I had this sense that I just needed to be there and be open. Be there and be open to what was happening and respond as well as I could. It was difficult. We were on a family retreat until the end. My sister, my dad, myself, and my mum. And there were some tender moments. There was some tender moments amidst all the turmoil of, she had young grandchildren. My mother was an artist primarily. She loved decorating houses. She was still in the last 2 weeks of her life trying to draw a picture of how this out part of their house was going to be done, an architect plan. My childhood was I started in the 1970s in a terrace house and moved back to the Edwardian and the Victorian. By the time I left school, I was in the Tudor age. She'd redecorated all the house like this, but she was still doing that to the end of her life, and she loved her family. She loved her grandchildren, her 2, 6 and 7 and 9 years old, and it was very painful around that. But I went to bed, and I'll tell you this, I'll just throw it out there, but I don't know what this means, but I went to bed. My mother was getting a little bit of morphine. We looked after her at home. She wanted to stay at home. She didn't want to go to hospice. She just wanted to stay at home, so we tried to do that. I was having a dream in the night, or at least I imagine I was having a dream. And suddenly I felt like I was visited by my mother. It was about 4 a.m, I later discovered. And it was like she intruded into a dream I was having, and we had a conversation. And she was in this, I was in this sort of old beamed cottage, which was where I was actually in. That was my bedroom, in the beamed cottage. And she was at the door as a spirit. Not as I couldn't see her, she was just a spirit of my mother. And she said, "Can I come in?" And I said, no, you can't come in, Mum. I said, "We don't want you hanging around behind doors, scaring people like this." We had this joke. I used to joke a lot with my mother, so that was our connection. She said, "Oh, can't I come in?" I said, "No, Mum, She said, "How many people can come in this room then?" And I said, "Well, one, Mum, it's just me." And as soon as I said that, she just went straight into my heart. And I heard her say, "Goodbye, my love." She just said, "Goodbye, my love," in a ringing voice like her voice, and she departed. Now, I got up. I felt elated, actually, or relieved, like in a very bodily way. Got my sister up, I got my dad up, and we sat by her bed, and I held my mum's hand. She was still breathing. And I did a practice. I didn't know what to do, really. I just meditated on that the self can't be found within any quarter of experience. That there's no self to be found within anything that you can experience. And I think in my mind it was like osmosis. If I was doing that, I thought by osmosis or some mysterious power that I've got no idea about, my mum would kind of get a bit of this. And she died for about 40 minutes later. I felt extremely present to her death. Now, of course, I could say later, and I went through, grief, and I went on retreat, which was solitary retreat, and experienced a lot of overwhelming grief about it all, which was very positive as well. But it was difficult after. But at that moment, I felt I was there, and I was watching my mother die, and one thought that occurred to me is that death's not a thing. Death isn't a thing. There's a massive amount of fear that had been projected into my mind about this moment that was too hard to imagine, too unimaginably, like my mother dying is like, it's one of the hardest things. But she just died, and it wasn't a thing. I can't quite say it any more than that. And her visiting me, and was the end of my nihilism. I no longer, I can say that I no longer believe that from my experience. I have no idea what happens after death. I don't know. It could be miraculously different to anything that I've yet conceived of. But I don't believe in the story that it's nothing. that there's just nothing. And that was my mother's last gift to me. Yeah. So, we're coming to the end, but I want to mention the Buddha's last days. So the Buddha was 80 years old when he died, or thereabouts. It's recorded in a sutta which describes the last weeks and months and days of his life. It's a very wonderful sutta to read, the Parinirvana Sutta, I think it's called. And it's him on a walking tour with his companion Mahananda and an entourage of monks, going around visiting the old places, visiting the old friends, visiting people. It's very human. It's a very human story. And he's suffering sharp pains. This is an expression that comes up. The Buddha felt pain. The Buddha felt sharp pains in his body. He knew that death was approaching, and he wanted to give people an opportunity to see him one last time, to clarify any last points, just to meet old friends. And the Buddha did say that it's sorrowful when someone dies. You know, it is. He missed some of his disciples who had died. You know, it's a human thing. He had a last meal at a blacksmith's or a silversmith's house, I never remember, but he apparently ate some food that was poisoned. Not deliberately poisoned, but had deteriorated. And he said, bury that all in a pit. Don't give that to anybody else. It'll certainly kill anyone else. And he later, told this probably horrified blacksmith who'd invited the monks around to take food that actually this was one of the greatest things you can ever do, to give the Buddha to give the meal that was the rice milk meal that was given to the Buddha before he became the Buddha when he was 35, and the last meal that a Buddha is given is a tremendous thing to have done. And then his companion, a lot of it's about this his companion being very upset, Ananda. He was upset because people were trying to muscle in on the Buddha and get his attention even on the last day of his life. The Buddha saw people and gave them teachings. The Buddha admitted people into his community in the last day of his life. And Ananda was annoyed by this, and Ananda was doing what we all do when we look after relatives. It's hard, it's just stressful. You're doubling down on all your energy to do well by the people you love. And he was very upset. He was very upset because the Buddha was dying, and he was very upset because he just felt like he hadn't really made progress. He hadn't made enough progress, and the Buddha was already dying. Death always happens too damn soon. There was that sense. You always feel. You don't always feel that, but certainly many people in the days is feeling this is too soon. You'd give anything for it to stop, wouldn't you? That was with my mother. I'd just give anything for this to stop now. Can we just call this whole thing off to another day? But of course you can't. And he rejoiced in Ananda. He praised Ananda for all the companionship and all the care and love that Ananda had given him, and basically said, "You'll be all right. You know the teaching. Reflect on the teaching. We've been through this, haven't we? Quite a number of times. All compounded things die, and that's just what's happening. You will become free." So he spent a lot of the last days reassuring people. And he chose to die in a place called Kusinara. I visited Kusinara with some people as well. This is in northern India. And a lot of the Buddhist sites, apart from Bodh Gaya, are rather archaeological in nature. They're like big piles of stones and surrounded by coach parks and things. But they can be a tiny bit disappointing. But this wasn't really. There was a real mound there, a real sort of big funeral mound. And just sitting there and doing meditation and puja, you got this feeling that you're in the place where there must have been all this activity going on. The Buddha died, he lay down between two trees. Ananda was again upset because it was in the middle of nowhere. He wanted him to die in a big fancy town. The Buddha said, "It's fine here. This is a place, you don't understand, this place used to be a great city. This is a wonderful place to die." So he just lay down and went through. You can read the story. It's a beautiful image of him lying down between two trees, resting his head on his hand, and going through the stages of meditation before he passed away. Bhante, our teacher, Bhante Sangha, died in October 2018. And my image of what the Buddhist funeral like is now sort of informed by his funeral. It was if you weren't there, it was a really remarkable event, and it was in England, and it was in a field, and it was surrounded by this ring of oak trees at Adhisthana there, and the sun was filtering in, a low sun was filtering in over some mist. I'm kidding you not, it was really that beautiful. And there was smoke rising up from the incense, and there was this beautiful chanting going on. And the atmosphere was so soft, it was so joyful. And there was about 1,500 people there, and there was a magic to that event that I don't expect I don't expect to feel again. And it wasn't expected, it wasn't like, oh great, I'm going to Bhante's funeral and we'll have this wonderful experience. It just lifted everybody, and it took everybody by surprise, and it was very magical and soft and uplifting occasion. So when I think of the Buddha's death, I imagine that must have been surrounded by an immense aura of calm and uplift, with the thousands of monks and lay followers who will have gathered. I want to end by some words from Lama Shenpen Hukum, from her book, There's More to Dying Than Death. And this book is great, actually. I don't remember everything in this book, but it's one of those books I read, and I just remembered a few things, and they really helped. Just a few little things, they really helped. And I'll end with what she says in the section entitled, Don't Panic. Having said all this about the importance of our attitude when we die, and how we need to trust our heart and rely on our heart connections and let go, when it comes to the actual moment, perhaps all we will be able to remember is this one simple phrase, don't panic. That is the vital point. If you forget all else, don't forget this. The more we can die with an underlying attitude of relaxed confidence, the less likely we are to panic and lose our way. We will be able to continue on the path to awakening from life to life for as long as it takes, always meeting Dharma companions and teachers and being helped along the path to awakening. How can we be sure? I suppose there is always room for doubt. But when the chips are down, you have to trust or panic. We have to trust or panic, don't we? Well, let's not panic. Let's trust. But trust what? We can learn to trust our heart, our true nature, our own inner wisdom, love and compassion, heart connections. That is possible. But is that enough to keep us on the path to awakening? From the Buddhist perspective, it is. If we fully trust that and don't panic, it is enough. It is enough because it is our true nature and therefore trustworthy. It is enough because even without knowing it, if we align ourselves with our hearts, we are naturally open to the power, the adhisthana, of the living reality of awakening. This manifests as the protection of all the awakened ones, who are there for us even if we do not recognize them or believe in them. We can believe in them or not, just as we like. They will still help us. Thank you.